Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, and this is an extra video in the Hotstart TBM 900 series. Extra videos are just a few minutes away from the simulator where we can look at some concepts from the videos in a bit more detail. Now, as my Hotstart TBM 900 series takes place in Scotland, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some of the airspace issues in the UK. The UK airspace is quite different from other parts of the world. And we can have a look at how that affects us as simulator pilots. Now, to look at the airspace, we're going to use an application on the iPad called SkyDemon. SkyDemon is a UK developed flight planning application. Specifically, it's developed initially for VFR pilots. It's expanded to cover other parts of the world, so we're looking at Florida at the moment. But it has very good airspace presentation because airspace is at the forefront of any UK VFR pilot's flight planning concerns. We're looking at Florida because it can be regarded, or the United States of America can be regarded as somewhat of a reference case for aviation. The vast majority of all the training materials that you can find online relate to flying in the US. So although strictly speaking, the reference case would be the International Civil Aviation Organization procedures, in practical terms, the US is a much more useful reference case. So this is a flight from Pompano Beach, just north of Miami, up overhead the Tampa class Bravo, and then on towards Cedar Key. If you're a fan of the Steve01 Knievo channel, you'll realise that this is a flight he did in a TBM 940 posted a few weeks ago. The routing is just a routing that I found on an online routing tool. But it's important from an airspace concept to understand that everything you see on the screen there, outside of the blue, Class Bravo, Class Charlie, Class Delta areas, is Class E airspace. Airspaces are from Class A through to Class G. A through to D is fully controlled for all traffic. F and G are uncontrolled for all traffic, and Class E is the boundary, if you like. If you're an IFR flight in Class E airspace, you're controlled. And if you're a VFR flight in Class E airspace, you are uncontrolled. Now, the vast majority of airspace below 18,000 feet in the United States is Class E airspace. Class G is there in remote areas and is there at very low levels, 700 feet or 1,200 feet above the surface. But the vast majority of airspace you would fly in as a VFR pilot is Class E airspace. So for Steve-O's flight from Pompano Beach across to Cedar Key, the flight would be reasonably straightforward from an airspace perspective. There's always routing considerations. You always have to consider which route you're going to use, which Victor airspace you're going to use. But from an airspace planning perspective, it's very straightforward. The flight originated in Pompano Beach. Pompano Beach is Class Delta airspace from the surface up to 2,500 feet. Now, if I was an IFR flight on an IFR clearance, when I go outside that Class D airspace, I'm still in controlled airspace because Class E is still controlled. And I climb up towards the northwest here. When I go above 18,000 feet, I'm in Class A airspace where only IFR traffic is permitted and it's fully controlled. So looking at the flight in Florida, on the whole here, on the profile view at the bottom, we start in Class Delta, we climb up through Class Echo, above 18,000 feet, Class Alpha airspace, and then back down again into Echo and then the airfield. There's very little airspace to be concerned about here. The only one that we'd really be interested in is we're going overhead Tampa Class Bravo. Even then, it only goes up to 10,000 feet, so it wouldn't affect our flight whatsoever. So airspace is important in the US. The way that it's structured is logical and straightforward and easy to understand from the charts. Most importantly, to take away from this, the concept is an IFR flight is controlled start to finish. It's always in controlled airspace. Being IFR essentially makes your flight controlled because you're in Class Echo airspace, so controlled from start to finish. Now let's have a look at the UK. So this is a flight that was part 1 and 2 of the video series, starting at Glasgow in the bottom left and up to Aberdeen in the top right. You can see that the aircraft operated inside an airspace corridor, if you like. So this area here, over the mountains, out to the west there, that's not Class E airspace in the UK, that's Class G airspace. If I zoom out a little bit further, everything you see outside the presented airspace there is Class G airspace. Now Class G is uncontrolled for all traffic. There may be air traffic control or air traffic radar services available or flight information services available, but you're not being controlled, they're only giving you information. It's a bit different for the military, but for civilian purposes there's no control outside of the controlled airspace. Before we look at that in any detail though, let's look at England here. There's Liverpool and Manchester in the middle of the screen at the moment. There's Birmingham, and finally Heathrow and Gatwick and Luton and Stansted. I'll zoom in a little bit just now. So there's Heathrow and Gatwick, Heathrow in the middle, London City just the east, and Gatwick. There's also Luton and Stansted the north. You can see between those, they're very close together. We've got Biggin Hill, we've got Fair Oaks, we've got White Waltham, we've got Red Hill right in the Gatwick control zone there. It's very, very busy. What I want you to keep in mind is the scale of the airspace here. So I'll zoom out and I'll move across from Heathrow and Gatwick across to Ireland here. Now there's almost like a figure 8 of airspace in the middle there. The northern circle is Shannon and the bottom circle is Cork. Between Shannon and Cork there are approximately 40 to 50,000 aircraft movements per year. The Irish structure is very simple. You've got Class G and Class C. It is very similar, the controlled airspace is very similar to the US, where you've got the upside down wedding cake. You've got a centre core controlled roughly down to the surface. You've got up to from 2,500 feet up, from 3,500 feet up. But what I want you to look at is the size of that airspace. Now bearing in mind Shannon and Cork are around about 40,000 aircraft movements per year. Come across to Heathrow and Gatwick, in the region of 700,000 aircraft movements per year. So the controlled airspace for commercial traffic is kept as small as is actually possible for the volume of traffic. That traffic needs to be protected. Those air traffic controllers are working really very hard to get all that traffic manoeuvred around in a small amount of airspace. So the airspace that they don't need is Class G airspace, so you don't have any controllers involved in it. This corridor here between Heathrow and Gatwick, now Heathrow and Gatwick are only about 20 miles apart, but if I look at the centre corridor here, there's Class A airspace down to 2,500 feet. But below 2,500 feet, it's Class G. It's completely and utterly uncontrolled. I could quite happily fly a Cherokee all the way around Gatwick, and indeed if I was doing it in this area here, just outside the base layer, I could fly around Gatwick at 1,000 feet, only 7 or 8 miles away from Gatwick, without speaking to MD. It doesn't necessarily mean that would be a smart thing to do, but it's possible to do that. So this airspace structure that looks very complex, it's made that way to make the maximum amount of airspace available as uncontrolled airspace. It's almost a chicken and egg situation. It's complicated to give us the most amount of freedom as a VFR pilot. Let's have a look at the specific flight we did in the TBM 900. So we got airborne from Glasgow in the southwest there and routing up towards Aberdeen on the northeast coast. You can see the flight operated inside a corridor of controlled airspace. Now let's look at the profile view down at the bottom. We've got the departure from Glasgow inside the Scottish Class D airspace. Then we climb up. We are in Class A airspace. And then you can see the waypoint Glesk here in the middle. You remember in the descent, I set flight level 90 to be level at Glasgow. That's because the airspace to the southwest of Glasgow only starts at flight level 85, so flight level 90 required to keep us inside controlled airspace. And this flight was entirely inside controlled airspace from start to finish. I could do that flight in a 737 or in a TBM or any other aircraft that's got that altitude capability. Importantly, in the middle section here, to remain inside controlled airspace, I had to be above flight level 105. Okay, so I'd need oxygen or pressurization to be there. I couldn't be there in an unpressurized non-oxygen aircraft. So the airspace is established to protect controlled aircraft, to protect commercial services. You can see another corridor from Aberdeen down towards Newcastle there. That's another airway. It's protected by Class D. So let's just zoom in here. If I switch SkyDemon to presenting the airways mode, you can see the airways just as you would have Victor routes in the US. But these routes are protected by controlled airspace. So rather than having Class E airspace everywhere, we have controlled airspace only where it's necessary. From a worldwide IFR pilot's perspective, that is not a problem. You leave from a controlled airfield inside controlled airspace, and your destination is a controlled airfield inside controlled airspace. There may be some minimum levels you have to achieve en route to remain inside controlled airspace, but fundamentally it's no different from IFR in any other part of the world. Looking at the profile view at the bottom, it may be a little bit more involved. There's a few different pieces of airspace we cross, but we're controlled from start to finish, so the work on the radio and the flight planning are largely the same. Okay? The next flight we're going to do in the TBM is a little bit different. We're going to take off out of Aberdeen and fly down towards Dundee. Now you'll notice that the airspace between, for example, Strathallan down here and up towards Aberdeen, you'll notice that's disappeared. That's simply because SkyDemon clips the airspace display so you don't see it if it's not necessary. And that's really useful. If we were planning a much lower level flight, let's say I was down at 3,000 feet. So if I bring all the arches down to 3,000 feet, there's another one in there somewhere. You see it starts to filter out the controlled airspace. So it'll only show the controlled airspace that's relevant. So the flight we're going to do goes from Aberdeen down towards Dundee. We're taking off in controlled airspace, and then we're routing outside controlled airspace. In the center of the screen here, you can see there's Class D airspace, 3,000 feet and above. And then outside, there's nothing, there's no airspace there. And that's reflected on the profile view. In the middle of the profile view, you can see the flight leaving controlled airspace. That's the flight entering Class G airspace. There are some differences between Scotland and England as to how the outside controlled airspace is handled. Scotland has a lower traffic density, and there are some controllers available to give you traffic information. In England, it's a little bit different, that the demarcation between controlled and uncontrolled is a radio thing as well as an airspace thing. But in Scotland, at higher levels, it's the same controllers that kind of do the job. We can see that if we look at the official documentation. So here's London Control with the Flight Information Service. There's 3 frequencies there, and these frequencies only deal with outside controlled airspace. Okay? They provide flight information, things like altimeter settings. They can help negotiate entry into controlled airspace, but they will not give you a control service. They'll hand you over to a controller to do that. These are information controls only. Okay? If I look at Scotland instead, so the Scottish control, it's got many different sectors there. It's this area AH we're interested in here. If I look at A and H, you see the A at low altitude below flight level 55 is an information sector, and H is a control information sector. So it's an air traffic controller that could give me a clearance into controlled airspace if that's what I needed to do. So Scotland is a little bit more like the US in that respect, but the airspace is still the same, UK-wide. Class G airspace, uncontrolled. That flight from Aberdeen to Dundee would be fairly straightforward to do. You leave controlled airspace, you speak to Aberdeen approach controllers, and it just works. If I was going the other way, it'd be a bit more difficult, because unlike Steve-O's flight in the US, if I get airborne out of Dundee and fly up towards Aberdeen, I'm not speaking to MD. I'm not necessarily speaking to MD on the radio. So I'm not automatically cleared into Aberdeen airspace. I need to call up Aberdeen by myself. I won't be handed over to them. I need to call them up and arrange that clearance into controlled airspace. It's very similar, in fact, as flying VFR. If I was flying out of Dundee and I wanted to join that high altitude controlled airspace structure, I would need specific clearance in there as well. And that's where the Scottish controllers can help you out. As a simulator pilot, anything above flight level 195 in UK is Class C, exactly the same as flying in Class A in the US. Exactly the same. At low levels, you either arrange the flight to remain inside those controlled airspace corridors, or you negotiate for entry and exit for controlled airspace as your flight demands. The easiest case is controlled airspace, like a controlled flight from Glasgow to Aberdeen, because that's very similar to what you'd experience in the rest of the world. A flight from controlled airspace to uncontrolled airspace is fairly easy. A flight from uncontrolled airspace, like going the opposite direction from Dundee to Aberdeen, is almost as easy. The most complicated flight you can do is a mid-altitude flight, 7,000 or 8,000 feet, trying to cross most of the UK, because you are going to be going in and out of controlled airspace the entire flight. Okay? At the mid-levels, you've got controlled airspace around airfields, you've got low-level airways to support aircraft climbing and descending into major airfields. You've got military zones on the east coast. You may have seen a video with Matt Guthmiller in a Cessna 210 flying from Wick down to Shoreham, and there's a lot of frustration in that video about how the UK airspace structure works, and I completely understand that. It is totally different from other parts of the world for IFR traffic. The big takeaway for a simulator pilot is at low level, be aware that entering and leaving controlled airspace. As an IFR pilot, you have to handle it the same way as a VFR pilot would handle it. You have to ensure the airspace clearance is received before you enter that controlled airspace. So I hope that makes sense. It's just a primer. There's a lot more reading you can do on the UK airspace. If you search for UK Flight Information Service, you'll find a lot more information about it. The takeaways for a simulator pilot in the UK: above flight level 195, exactly the same as the US. Below flight level 195, stay inside the controlled airspace corridors if you're simulating an airline flight, and consider getting in and out of controlled airspace if you're a VFR or a low-level IFR flight, something like a Piper Arrow or a TB20 or a Malibu, something operating at the mid-levels. Consider how you're going to get in and out of controlled airspace. Thanks very much for listening. It's a complicated subject, so if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section below. Otherwise, I hope you join me for part 3, where we'll look at that flight from Aberdeen down to Dundee. Thanks for watching.